Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. CAR-T, or chimeric antigen receptor T-cell therapy, represents a new approach in blood cancer treatment showing promising results for many, especially those with myeloma. Today, our guests are going to delve into what CAR-T means for myeloma care, its impact, and what the future may hold for this therapy. My name is Sabrina Hanna, and I am the Chief Change Officer at the Cancer Collaborative, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Let me quickly introduce you to our guests. Henry Chan is the CAR-T Medical Director for Canada at Johnson & Johnson Innovative Medicine. Prior to joining JJIM, Henry was a practicing hematologist in New Zealand. He obtained his medical degree from the University of Auckland in New Zealand and later completed his hematology training under the Royal Australia College of Physicians and Royal College of Pathologists of Australasia. Henry was actively involved with teaching, patient advocacy, and research before his pivot into the pharmaceutical industry. He has a master's of business administration with a focus on digital, and he is also the diversity, equity, and inclusion representative for the pharmaceutical sector at J&J in Canada. In his spare time, Henry spends his time with his wife and two daughters on simple things like riding a bike and going to the beach, and as you will see later, on arts and craft. Dr. Michael Chu is a clinician scientist at the Cross Cancer Institute. He completed his medical training, including general internal medicine residency and medical oncology fellowship at the University of Alberta. Dr. Chu was then awarded a Leukemia and Lymphoma Society fellowship for a combined clinical and research fellowship at Stanford University. Upon returning to Edmonton, his clinical focus includes lymphoma, myeloma, and central nervous system malignancies. Academically, his research focuses on basic and translational cancer research with an emphasis on immune therapy, including monoclonal antibodies and cellular therapy. He also has a wide range of clinical research where he serves as principal investigator and sub-principal investigator on multiple phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials. Dr. Chu is actively involved in trainee education, particularly with the local medical oncology fellows providing both didactic and bedside teaching. When not working hard at the Cross Cancer Institute, Dr. Chu is also a loving husband and father while maintaining his interests in various hobbies, including basketball, photography, and piano. And finally, Jessie Ranger is the Director, Patient Programs, Health Policy and Advocacy at Myeloma Canada, which she joined in 2018. Jessie has over 18 years experience in organizational and cross-sector communications, both within not-profit organizations and the Quebec healthcare system. Her talents as a communicator, her commitment to the community, and her work in both community and government relations have enabled her to mobilize players from all walks of life to promote the interests of patients and defend the role in the evolution of the Canadian healthcare system. Today, as the Director of Health Policy, Advocacy, and Patient Services, Jessie develops all advocacy and educational projects for patients and caregivers, as well as establishing strategies for the creation of new community services and continuing Myeloma Canada's work in redefining cancer care and services for all Canadians. And Jessie, when it's your turn to speak, maybe you can tell us what your hobbies are. Just before we begin, there will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the presentations. Please do feel free to add them into the chat function as they come to you. And with that, Henry, we will start off with you.
Great. And hi, everyone. So once again, my name is Henry Chan. I'm from Johnson & Johnson, and it's great to be here. It's great to be talking to all of you. Even though we've been doing these virtual webinar for a few years now, it is always slightly awkward, I think, at the beginning, talking to a screen. But hopefully you can feel the enthusiasm and the excitement that I have in my voice. So I have prepared some slides because what I've been asked is to provide a very high-level overview of what CAR-T therapy is. And as you have heard Sabrina earlier on, she mentioned that I am going to be doing some art and craft. So hopefully this will work. So it will either be amazing or it will be a failure, but either way, I'm sure you will get a lot out of it. So before I start, I do need to provide some disclaimer. And is that the information that I'm about to share is solely for the purpose of this webinar. It's not to be distributed or disclosed to any third party. The webinar is an open discussion. The opinion expressed by myself or participants are those of the individuals and does not necessarily reflect the viewpoint of Johnson & Johnson. And of course, the material that I'm about to be shared is, sorry, I mentioned this, and that Johnson & Johnson will be monitoring the webinar for any adverse event, and under our obligation, we will need to report that to Health Canada. So with that out of the way, I'm going to start off with this slide. And many of you would have seen probably lots of diagrams, videos about how CAR-T works, and there are many of those that are of very high quality, showing the cells moving in and attacking the cancer cell. But what I thought I would do is, because I'm a very hands-on person, I would like to do it more of a kind of interactive way. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second. So many of you know that we have an immune system, and part of our immune system are these cells called lymphocytes. Now, lymphocytes, I've got a picture of it right here. So lymphocytes are very amazing cells. They kind of roam around the body, and they find cells that are not quite normal. So for example, a cell that has been infected, and so the lymphocyte will come along, and with this purple blob here is a receptor, finds it, tag onto it, and then destroys the infected cell. And quite often I think of the lymphocyte like me going to a supermarket. There are lots of things in the supermarket. I don't know what I want to get, so I've got a list of grocery that I need to buy. So I recognize those grocery and then I pick them off. So lymphocytes are really good at finding abnormal cells, and to a certain degree, they can also recognize cancer cells, but they're not very good at doing so, and they're not very good at targeting them. So here we've got a plasma cells. Let's just say this is the myeloma cells. You've got the lymphocyte coming along, but the receptor just doesn't quite recognize it, so it just moves along, and the cancer cell remains there. So what the scientists have discovered is that, well, lymphocytes are really good at killing abnormal cells, but the problem is they don't recognize these abnormal cancer cells. So what they have done is that they have taken the lymphocyte, they send it off to the lab and changed the receptor. So as you can see, now the receptor gone from purple to red. And what they can do now, hopefully this will work with my art and craft. Here we go. Is that now the cell can come along and go, well, this is a plasma cells. And then here we go. It will work. It will work. It will recognize the cell and get rid of it. But at the same time, for other cells that it doesn't have the antigen on the surface, so these normal cells, the CAR-T will not be able to target them. And so a lot of those videos that you will see in many of the resources online is basically illustrating the same process. So when we say CAR-T, the CAR stands for chimeric antigen receptor, which is a new receptor in essence that we have given to the T cell. So the T stands for T cells, so that now the new CAR-T cells will be able to recognize the cancer cell, will be able to get close to it, bind to it, and then eventually destroy the cells. And how this is done, and probably Dr. Chu will be able to provide more in-depth explanation at a later time, is that for most of the CAR-T nowadays, we use what we call autologous T cells. So we use the patient's own T cells. So we harvest the T cells from the patient's bloodstream, because remember, T cells, they are floating around, circulating the body, kind of like a security guard looking for any abnormal cells. So we harvest these T cells, we send them off to the lab, and then we introduce the new receptor, and usually we do this by infecting the cell with lentivirus, so that the cell now expresses this new receptor, and just like what I've demonstrated, expressing that red receptor on the diagram or the demonstration that I have shown. And then once the cells are made, then we will infuse the cells back to the body, back to the patients, where they will proliferate and then circulate around the body to find the cancer cells. And with that, hopefully, it will be able to reduce disease burden, and depending on the disease and depending on the condition, lead to some good clinical outcome. And so with this, I'm just going to take a pause, or maybe I'll just pass it back to Sabrina.
Thank you, Henry. I don't think that I have ever seen CAR-T described this way, and I really appreciate it. Can you talk to us a little bit about what the future of CAR-T can look like?
Yeah, for sure. I think, and once again, I've got another slide for this, and I'll just quickly show it. I think the future of CAR-T is very exciting. And the reason for it is because we are still at a very early stage of in terms of understanding what CAR-T can do. A lot of research has gone into it, and a lot more research will go into it into the future. But I think because the immune system is such an amazing and a complex machine, there's a lot of work going on now to get a better understanding of why some CAR-T works and why some CAR-T don't. In particular, why do the cells develop resistance to the CAR-T? And so by understanding that mechanism, we will be able to better understand how we should use CAR-T and when should use it. There's also a lot of work when it comes to identifying new targets. So we've got a target that's commonly used for the lymphoma. There's also a target being used for myeloma, but there are also other targets that are being explored. So that potentially, if let's say the cancer cell becomes smart and not express a certain antigen, maybe we can use another CAR-T that targets a separate target so that it will still work for that patient. CAR-T is currently available or at least being approved for lymphoma, for myeloma, but certainly there's work of using CAR-T in other malignant conditions or other cancers or even non-cancerous conditions as well. And both internationally and also within Canada, there's research in terms of improving the efficacy of the CAR-T, make the CAR-T stronger, make it more robust so that we can achieve a better clinical outcomes. Of course, CAR-T is not just a drug where you give it to the patient. CAR-T is the whole process. It's the whole manufacturing process. So there's lots of research about how we can shorten the manufacturing time, how we can make the manufacturing more robust so that we can meet the clinical need of the patient. So I think there's a lot of things that is available in the future, and it is a very bright future when it comes to CAR-T.
Thank you, Henry. And given your wonderful explanation of how CAR-T works, Dr. Chu, can you walk us through how CAR-T works specifically in myeloma now?
Yeah, so excellent question. Thank you. And thank you, Henry, for that great presentation. I particularly loved your use of props. I agree. I have not seen a arts and craft version of explanation of CAR T cells, so I quite appreciated that. So in myeloma, so as Henry alluded to, and the way it works as well in leukemia lymphoma, is that there are specific targets that the cells can go after. I use the example to patients of calling it barcodes. There are some very unique barcodes that exist on myeloma cells or in cancer cells in general, and those barcodes are unique to the individual malignancy. There is typically usually more than one barcode that can be gone after, and the present ones are more so focused on specific ones at this present time. So as Henry alluded to, that some of the future directions are going after some of these additional barcodes. But essentially for the time being, the CAR T cells that are approved in Canada go after a specific one called B-cell maturation antigen, or BCMA for short. And what happens is that when the T cells come out of the patient, they get manipulated, as you heard, and turn into super soldiers. When they come across this barcode, it will activate the T cell and stimulate them to kill. On top of that, they're actually able to recruit some of the normal T cells. And in a lot of cases, what happens is that a cancer patient's immune system becomes sleepy or becomes tired. And so the CAR T cell is able to overcome that and help to recruit those sleepy or tired T cells to reinvigorate them and get them recruited into the action. That can persist for several months to years in some cases, and the hope is that the longer it lasts for, the more likely it's able to provide a long-term remission in myeloma patients.
Thank you. And so what does the introduction of CAR T mean for people with myeloma?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing is another treatment in the arsenal, and a very effective one at that. So there are several CAR T cells are being explored. And now, a couple of examples are in their short versions of cilta-cel and ide-cel, both targeting BCMA. And in the studies that have led to their approvals in Canada, they did lead to substantial improvements in long-term remission, and it provided another therapy for patients that had no other therapies remaining to them. So in comparison, after providing years of remission in these two different constructs, these patients would normally be thought to be palliative within months. And so obviously that's a substantial improvement in their long-term outlooks. The hope is that by providing this therapy potentially even earlier in their treatment plan, that in theory, this might even be something that works better. The idea, if you're starting off with the patient's own T cells, the less chemotherapy they're exposed to, the thought is that they would have a much more functional CAR T cell as well earlier on. But that's obviously something that's still very much in the research space, and we have yet to find that out.
And do we know which patients would be eligible for CAR T?
Yeah, eligibility is an interesting question just because it's something that we're still trying to figure out for ourselves in real time. I'll reflect back on our greater experience with leukemia and lymphoma, since we've had use of CAR T cells in that space as a standard of care for several years now. And that told us that there is probably no specific restrictions or persons that work better or less better for CAR T cells. Obviously there are some probably unique features on individual patients that suggest maybe not applying one to the other. Obviously frailty is always a concern. No matter what, CAR T cells is a very aggressive treatment, and so we always worry about the potential to harm and hurt patients. And so we want to be very judicious in those individuals. Now that comes at the balance of trying to make sure that you still treat and give opportunities for these some patients, because perhaps their frailties because of their disease. So in theory, if you treat their malignancy, that might actually improve their overall abilities and reverse some of that frailty. Now, on the other hand, if you look at the patients that were treated on these trials, pretty much across the board, almost everybody had some type of benefit, and that's part of the reason why that there's a lot less restriction on there. In fact, if anything, there are some patients that would be considered stem cell transplant ineligible that in fact are CAR T eligible, as an example as to the broadened context of who may or may not be able to receive CAR T cells. But I think it's really the frailty and perhaps patients that have very aggressive diseases that don't allow us time to provide them CAR T cell therapy. Those are probably the bigger factors that will restrict people from being able to receive the treatment. And just to touch on one last point there with that last bit there in terms of time, remember that we have to manufacture the CAR T cells after we've harvested those T cells in the first place, which means that there's an inherent delay from the time that we say, let's go and do this, to when we actually have the product to give it to them. And in some cases, the patient's diseases are so aggressive that they can't wait those few weeks to be able to get their CAR T cells back. And that would be potentially introducing harm to them if we tried to wait that long to be able to get that therapy for them. So, rooms for improvement for sure.
Is part of that improvement receiving CAR T in earlier lines of treatment?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, usually the disease becomes more and more aggressive as time goes on. The working idea is that we're selecting for a more aggressive disease after different lines of therapy, almost in an evolutionary type of idea where we're just selecting for the strongest cancer cells by the end. So in theory, yes, that there probably are more patients that we can treat as the earlier treatments. The idea too is that they'll be younger and therefore hopefully less frail as we give them treatment. So hopefully, yes, I think there's something to be said about innovation, where hopefully the manufacturing will be a little bit more rapid as time goes on. One thing that my group likes to look at is point of care manufacturing or local manufacturing of CAR T cells. Certainly as a more traditional manufacturing protocol, we're still able to shorten down the manufacturing time by several weeks compared to certain other products. So hopefully, there's going to be innovation in the future that will make it even more rapid.
I mean, I appreciate that you brought that up, and Henry did talk about the future potential for CAR T, but maybe can you just touch on the potential of point of care manufacturing for CAR T?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think that the interesting thing with CAR T cells and cell therapy in general, as it stands right now with an autologous CAR T cell, the starting material is the patient's own T cells. Unlike a traditional drug where essentially you're combining a bunch of chemicals, or in the case of antibodies, where you're having to generate the antibody from cells, with the starting material being the patient, and that would require the cells to be then sent to somewhere else for manufacturing before coming back in a typical centralized format. But if there's a infrastructure support, realistically, then some things might be sped up. The process of making CAR T cells has been studied for several years and decades. And in fact, actually, the process is not overly complicated, but not terribly so. And that if a lab were to be set up at individual centers, that in theory, we could be able to manufacture the patient cells at the site and reduce some of those shipping times. And so that's where point of care comes into play. Certainly, there are multiple examples in clinical trials out there that have done so, not just our own, and that you can limit the time required for patients to wait to get their CAR T cells back down to days, as opposed to weeks in some instances. Now, to be fair, though, I mean, the future of CAR T cells is very widespread in cell therapy in general. So there's the allogeneic CAR T cells, the idea of using a healthy donors or some other person's T cells, which in theory may be healthier compared to a patient's. Other cell types, our group is also looking at natural killer cells as an allogeneic product as well. So taking a healthy person's, or in some cases, cord blood from newborn babies, and taking their NK cells to manipulate and turn into CAR NK cells. Some of it also is looking at different ways of targeting. Is it one target, two targets, three targets? Does it have to be one product or multiple products? There's interestingly a lot of permutations and combinations. This is where the heads of my grad students start to spin, because it's hard to fathom all the different combinations or permutations that are starting to pour out there.
Thank you, Dr. Chu. And maybe I'll ask both you and Jesse to comment on the experience for patients with CAR T.
Maybe I'll ask Jesse to comment first.
So in terms of experience, I think community members, they're just very interested by this innovative therapy in general, like all the innovative therapies that came for myeloma. Anything that is new and is promising with better results, or even just the time without treatment after you're done with the CAR T part, is very important to them, because they want to go back to their life. There's still some patients who won't be eligible and might be afraid by the whole process, because this is very demanding and could be harmful for some, or even stressful because of the time period of wait. We've known a few patients who had great experience participating in clinical trials, but also some patients who didn't make it. So I think both are unfortunately the situation we have right now, but still very promising. And patients are just waiting for what's next. Like, they believe that, of course, this is kind of science fiction for everybody. They believe this is something that will maybe get us closest to a cure at some point. With all these development, it has evolved like so drastically over the past years. I think they feel that this is coming, and eventually we'll get to the best treatment possible, if it's not a cure.
Yeah, I think what Jesse touched on there is something that I would say is a theme amongst all patients that I've taken through cell therapy. Again, predominantly my experience is through leukemia and lymphoma cell therapy, so I can reflect on that. Now, obviously, a very similar treatment is bispecific antibodies, of which I've taken several dozens of patients through on the myeloma side as well. And I think the biggest theme that I would say amongst all of them is hope. Really, after having had so many other therapies, to still have something remaining to them as a treatment option provides just that degree of hope. Now, obviously, not everyone has responded well or done well as a result of this treatment. So, again, there's a bit of a tempering of expectations in some regard. But having said that, I mean, providing some degree of positive outlook is always a good thing for both mental psyche, but also for their general health. The experience is quite variable. I would say that some patients have had a very easy time, other patients have had a very difficult time. I think there's something to be said about the short-term side effects with the cytokine release syndrome and the neurologic toxicity that can happen to patients. While for the most part it is manageable and something treatable as a side effect, but it is unnerving to see it as the patients go through. I would say that patients themselves can recognize some of the neurologic side effects in particular if they start developing a bit of a tremor, or their writing goes off, or for example, their speech goes off, and it becomes stressful in that regard. So part of it is just, setting up the expectation, look, this is normal, we'll get you through this in the large majority of folks. I think in the long term for patients that have done well and are responding well, I think one of the things that is not well understood is that in some ways you're trading one problem for another. The immune suppression related to these therapies, both CAR T cells and bispecifics, is quite significant. Dr. Miklos in Stanford talks about this all the time, that in fact, actually, we're giving these patients a lot of infectious complications afterwards. And if you look at the number one killer of these patients after cell therapy is, in fact, infection. How best to manage the situation is not clear. And so, in a scenario where that's the case, we're kind of throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks. They're on a lot of preventive antimicrobials, antibiotics, antivirals, and as well as intravenous immunoglobulin, where basically we're supporting them with healthy people's antibodies. And unfortunately, we don't know when to stop that. And so as a result, they're still coming back and forth for treatments. No, it's not chemo. They feel great, or I should say feel great, but they feel okay afterwards, not like chemotherapy side effects. But it's still frequent trips back and forth to the cancer center. It's still something to worry about and something in the back of their minds. So, I do think that hopefully a future iteration will be how to figure out some of these post-treatment complications and long-term immunosuppression issues.
Yeah, I appreciate that you brought up the possible side effects. And what was really interesting with the first generation CAR Ts is that not everybody had side effects when they received the CAR T. And so when they didn't have the side effects, they thought it wasn't working. So I'm assuming it would be the same in the myeloma population, that some people will have side effects and varying degrees of side effects, and then some people may not have any side effects at all.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I guess to build on that, some of that's even dependent on construct differences as well. So, getting into some slightly nitty-gritty details, both products that are found to be effective in myeloma with ide-cel and cilta-cel both target B-cell maturation antigen, BCMA, but the incidence of side effects is a little bit different between them. Now, cross-study comparisons, so it's hard to know whether or not there are inherent differences in those patients. But I suspect that if you look back at, for example, leukemia lymphoma, if you look at axi-cel versus lysocell or tisagen, the use of CD28 as an activating domain for axi-cel has led to a lot of differences in toxicity compared to tisagen or lysocell that uses 4-1BB instead. Now, not to get into details in that regard, but I think that the way that the CAR T cells are manufactured or how they're designed plays a substantial part, because it does change the side effect profile and how those patients experience it. Looking at our own CAR T cell that we manufacture point of care, the side effect rate is extremely low, to the point where we were almost lulled into a false sense of security that we could have treated all these patients as an outpatient. And then we brought on standard of care with axi-cel, and then we were like, oh my goodness, why are these people so sick in the short term? So it can be a very eye-opening experience from an individualized patient perspective. So I always warn patients to prepare for the worst and hope for the best. Now, the large majority of patients, we can get them through a lot of those short-term side effects as a matter of just obviously being careful and coaxing it along. But it is a very individualized experience.
Yeah. And so I just want to touch a little bit on the accessibility of CAR T for the myeloma patients. And Jesse, I invite you to chime in on this as well.
Yeah, accessibility is the first concern, I would say, in general, for many reasons. First of all, there's not many centers who can administer and be prepared to take care of CAR T patients. That's one thing, but also manufacturing. There's a few amount of weeks in between the time we take the cells and we need to go into production and be able to give the cell back to the patient. The fact that there's not too many options of technically available right now. Price has not been negotiated yet, but this is a concern for accessibility, because of course, for myeloma patient and as a patient organization, we want as most options as possible. So homegrown CAR T, if we could have like other companies eventually to get approved and have many options as possible for patients. So if one is not necessarily available, maybe another one would be available and could maybe fit better the patient profile. That's also one thing. But I think mainly our biggest concern right now is the capacity. And I've mentioned the amount of center who are able to administer and take care of CAR T patient, but that's not just it. The amount of CAR T patient who can actually receive it in those centers is very limited. Myeloma is not the only one. We're actually the new one at the table. So this is a huge concern for patients, but also caregivers and for us, because at some point, if this therapy evolves to be what we all believe it could be and give the best results we can have in terms of disease management, but also in terms of treatment-free time, everybody would want to have access to that. But we're pretty sure right now that in the setting of our healthcare systems, we won't be able to respond to the demand, which is a concern. And maybe I can add, of course, now our system approves it for later line of therapies, and we're all looking to have it earlier. So patients are healthier and more fit, and maybe we'll get better results. But in the setting we are having right now, we wouldn't be able to give it anyway because of capacity. So that's a huge concern.
Yeah, I completely agree. You know, I think that for me, I worry about capacity on both sides of this equation, on the healthcare system side as well as on the manufacturing side. On the manufacturing side, I mean, I think that there's ways around that. You know, obviously, point of care is again one option to potentially meet some of the demand that is required. You know, that is definitely something that's established now on different levels. You know, the other option would be to ensure that the different companies that are coming forward with CAR T cell products have doubled or tripled down on their manufacturing capacity to be able to handle that. Now, obviously, these are expensive things to have to maintain, and so you can understand where they would centralize under specific locations. But you know, for the demand that's going to be happening worldwide, is there actually the capacity to be able to respond to that demand? And you know, I think that you know, as part of the negotiation, not that I'm a part of any of that, would probably how much can they actually accommodate? How much can they actually provide to the country if they're coming forward with a CAR T product? I do worry about the timing of that just because, you know, as we started onboarding standard of care, certain products were coming back very slowly compared to others. And that just meant that these patients were withering away and you're providing a very aggressive therapy for someone that's now become even more frail as a result. So it is a concern. And, you know, to Jesse's point, you know, the capacity on the healthcare system side is a significant concern as well. You know, certainly there's a big push to try to make use of what we have. If we're not going to be able to build more hospital beds and be able to provide more nursing care or physician care, could we provide this as an outpatient? And can we get a little bit more creative with an out-of-the-box approach and trying to manage these patients at home for as much as they can? Part of that reflects back on my earlier point that is very construct and patient dependent. You know, obviously someone's at high risk of having problems, definitely no, not as an outpatient. But if someone might be doing well and the construct has done well in our hands, then I can't see why not, as we can oftentimes manage this thing over several days and hours as opposed to minute by minute. So I think there's ways around it, but you know, definitely there's some murkiness to the immediate future of capacity issues that I'm not quite confident of. As a result of that, I do worry that there can be several patients that will not receive CAR T cell therapy that are eligible to do so and are suitable to do so just simply because of that.
And then, Jesse, how do you plan to respond to that as an advocacy group? You know, the patients who are eligible and who won't be able to receive it as an advocacy group. What is your plan?
We already have been working on some kind of a business case for CAR T for sure, because this is a huge priority for community members. As I said, it's the closest we've been to a cure, and it's kind of very promising. But it's very individual. We need to meet with all the provinces and look at the issues and try to bring people together for finding solutions. We've started with Ontario and Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan is actually better than others right now. You're kind of an example. In terms of thinking, you've thought this through more than others, and Quebec is a very difficult situation, because actually when we talk about options, having all the options available and thinking about homegrown CAR-T and how we can maybe finance and make sure that we have more project of either from manufacturer or homegrown, and make sure that we have more options available. In Quebec, with INES, it's difficult if it's an homegrown CAR-T and doesn't have an official approval from Health Canada, and that the process at Health Canada is not necessarily the same and approved, it could be administered. So we have like different issues to look at for all the provinces. But I would say in the next 2 or 3 years, our first objective would be just to make sure we have as much options as possible, that anything that could be done to reduce the delay is done. Of course, we cannot pretend to resolve the shortage of that staff issue, which would be something in terms of capacity as well, not just beds. If we don't have the staff, we won't be able to do it. But there's still some work that can be done on the healthcare in general that can contribute to finding solutions to address that issue. So those are the main priorities for now, and we're just sitting at all tables where we can.
And so what was really interesting with CAR-T, with the first generation of CAR-Ts, is that generally as patient advocates, we're always knocking at the door of Health Canada and CDA and INES, but when the first CAR-Ts came, it was like they were knocking at our door because they really wanted to have these conversations with us and the clinicians and industry. And do you feel like even now, when we've already gone through the process with the leukemias and the lymphomas, that these organizations are still coming to knock on the door for the myeloma community to better understand what's happening?
Yes, because of the capacity issue. Because I'll give an example in Quebec again. I'm sorry, but this has been the province I've been working the most this year on that issue. But the capacity is 200 on 3 years for the province. We already have that number with lymphoma. So what are we going to do with myeloma patients? And it will be something very concerning for some provinces that haven't thought about bringing people to the main centers at some point too. So we've been asked now to comment and give our impression on the problematics that we see in the future, and how we've seen maybe other solutions brought up to the table, and how this could be applied in a different setting. We still receive a lot of, because now I think implementation and being able to address this capacity issue is very, very important, now that there's another one coming eventually when the price will be set. And we haven't seen that earlier before, not on our hand, because myeloma was not really on the table. But now that it is, we've been consulted a few times.
Yeah. Well, now that myeloma is an extra indication for CAR-T, it really significantly increases the number of people who are eligible to receive it. And so when we talk about capacity, is it just like a question of, and maybe Michael, you can chime in on this one as well, is it just a question of we need more hospitals who can administer this?
Partially, yes. I mean, the physical space is one thing. I mean, definitely for the monitoring and the high-risk patients, they need to stay as an inpatient, at least for the short term. So that is definitely one piece. But the nursing care and the physicians are definitely needed as well. I can speak to our center in Edmonton that, part of the problem, of course, is the lack of training or experience as well. Really our cell therapy team is focused on for hematologist oncologists amongst the larger group, just because we want to centralize care to a degree to maintain competency to be able to handle these situations. The reality is that it takes a little bit of experience before you recognize when to intervene, how to intervene, and a bit of a case by case basis type thing too. So it takes experience, but really it's the nursing care and the physician care that I think are going to be required. Now, to try to do what I was mentioning earlier with outpatient management, that also requires quite a bit of infrastructure support. You need a touchdown space for people to be able to come in. That requires after hour capability of entering the facility, weekend usage, a nurse to be able to man that and be able to participate in the care as well. So while it's lacking for physical space, you still need infrastructure support for even outpatient management.
I don't know, Jesse, if you wanted to add on to that, but
I agree. So yes, the space for sure. We would like to have more center, but at least with the centers we already have available, making sure we have enough time and personnel to take care of those patients and be able to administer and follow up on the CAR-T. This is not something that will be easy, and I think our healthcare system are really at limits right now, and staff shortage has been very a big issue. So we still need to address that before thinking about opening new centers. If we already have some that are working, we need to maximize that and make sure we have a plan for those who won't be living near the biggest center and will have to maybe move for a while or stay closer than they used to, or even just travel. That's the first thing. And after, of course, opening more centers, this is what we would like.
And I'll throw out the question to all of you. And Henry, I don't know if you have any thoughts that you would like to contribute to the conversation. But I'll throw out you go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say it's very interesting to hear the comment from Dr. Chu and also Jesse. Definitely, unlike other products, I think cellular therapy is one where everyone, as in government, the industry, the clinicians, the patient, we all need to work together because it is so different to what we have.
Well, that was going to be my question, actually. So what type of collaborations need to happen now in this space for people who need CAR-T to get CAR-T? And not just what type of collaborations, but what do they look like?
Well, I guess I can start off first and obviously defer back to my colleagues on the panel here. But I think that part of it is the innovation. I think that certainly more improvements in the manufacturing process are definitely needed. I don't mean to belabor the point of care idea, but it is definitely something that would allow us to treat earlier and more rapidly. The example I'll give again is in our own center that having had point of care manufacturing, we were able to accommodate a lot more patients for CAR T cell treatment that would have qualified for standard of care that just didn't have access to it at the time when it became approved but not yet funded in Canada. So, as a result of that, as an individual site, we have almost 100 patients that have received CAR T cells now just simply because we had access to point of care. So I think that our percentage of usage is probably higher compared to a lot of other centers that did not have that capability or that capacity. But I mean, certainly the more rapid manufacturing times that are starting to be explored is another idea. I think being able to turn it around much more quickly will allow for more patients to be treated. Earlier lines of therapy, as we mentioned. Collaboration-wise, certainly I think that part of that requires the innovation to happen on both fronts. I think that we come with the patients. Pharma obviously comes with a lot of innovations in the other therapies. It'd be nice to be able to explore, the more rapid manufacturing, be able to take some of the products that they have available and see whether we can adapt it to a point of care type of idea. And a more of a hybrid approach. I think that having spoken to Health Canada on several times, there's an interest in doing something hybrid like that. That also requires collaboration with Health Canada, because then how do you approve such a therapy? And I think that there's a common ground here that needs to be met somewhere in the middle for everyone.
Maybe I can add that regarding innovation, I think one thing that we all realize is that the innovation has moved quicker than what our system could absorb. So I think it will also take from our respective governments across provinces to have a really a huge work on thinking how we would approach healthcare in the future like an integrated, completely integrated innovations, and not be at the mercy of waiting for the next to come and not being able to adapt. The flexibility of all of this, like just the regulation process, it has changed over time, but we need to be a bit more quicker into the adaptation of integrating all of this. And this is not only one province, it's across the country. So we could benefit from exchanging with other provinces, and maybe some part of the solution is in BC and the other part is in Saskatchewan and the other part is in New Brunswick or Quebec. This is what will be needed like very soon, because this is only the tip of the iceberg, right?
And I'll just add one other comment. I think in order to improve access, I think every little effort, no matter how small it may seem, will have an impact. So I like what Jesse was saying about having quick access to treatment. So even things like before we can launch a product at a site, the site needs to go through the training process, need to go through the activation process. So just simple things like speeding that up, streamlining the effort, and providing the adequate investment in terms of time and resources could potentially allow a site to be activated earlier, and that will translate into being able to treat patients earlier. So yes, there are things that we look to the future about innovation, new technology, but at the same time, simple day-to-day operational collaboration and streamlining that process will also have a great impact for the patients.
Yeah, and Jesse, you talked about the idea of modernizing our frameworks, but I feel like this is the discussion we've been having for at least 10 years. And so how do we actually get to that point where we're modernizing our frameworks so that the people who are making the decisions understand that while these innovative drugs are costly, downstream it's actually more beneficial to the healthcare system? And Dr. Chu, I don't know if you would like to also comment on that.
Oh my God, this is a very, like you said, permanent question. I think it's through the kind of work that we do. I know we often feel like as patient organization that we like are knocking at the same door all the time because our government settings are also made in 4 years. After you've been elected, you just have 4 years to do the work, and then someone else will pick up. And the idea of being reelected might have you like think about other things than just doing what needs to be done. But being persistent with our work, I think is one thing. I also believe that industry and just the clinicians, I think now clinicians have probably more power than they used to in terms of being heard. There's a lot of mechanism that been like integrated and evolved for us to be able to say what we think. So I think every opportunity we get as patient groups, even individual patients, sometimes they have platforms available, industry and clinicians, just to make sure that we comment and we give our ideas, because at the pace that everything is going now, the governments are looking for solutions. They just don't have the time to think about it and necessarily like have maybe all the right people around them to think about it. So we need to use those platforms to make sure that the best ideas will eventually emerge and change what needs to be changed.
Yeah, and I'll throw this question to all of you. Are there any global best practices out there that you're aware of regarding CAR T specifically?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I don't think there is a global best practice per se. I mean, there's a general idea and a concept as to how to manage these folks. I think part of it is just experience, quite frankly. Definitely, there are obviously guidances and groups that have published their experiences and how they manage things, and usually quite accurate and very, very helpful ones. But I think until individual centers and individual providers get experience, don't think you really know how to go about those things until you do it in real time. So, I think that while there are guidelines, probably I wouldn't say there's a very gold standard, this is how you do it type of thing. And just to build on what both Jesse and Henry have said, that realistically there are definitely some administrative red tape things that should be improved upon. I would reflect on some of our pharma colleagues to be able to help break down some of those barriers with government and hopefully educate them that this is really, as Jesse pointed out, the tip of the iceberg, because the what we are doing now is modeled off of what traditional approvals are for other therapies. And realistically, that's not cutting it, and really, that leads to a very slow down in implementation. And so if we can figure that part out things, I think that would obviously help down the road for future cell therapies.
Henry, I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly make some comments following what Dr. Chu has said. I think definitely based on what we have seen in other market where our product has been launched, there's always this learning curve. So initially, as Dr. Chu alluded to, the clinicians are getting that experience, but once they've got the experience, they will be able to manage the patients more efficiently and also streamline their process. So coming back to the discussion around access, certainly initially it may feel like it is a daunting task, but clinicians are smart and they are very resourceful. They will find a way to streamline the process and basically make the most out of the system that we have.
So there is a question in the chat that I'm going to ask. How are other pharma with CAR T pipeline contributing to making these therapies available for patients in real time? Dr. Chu, do you want to take the first stab at this?
Sure. I mean, I would say that obviously trying to help out and try to do things concurrently. I mean, part of it, of course, is there's multiple parts to the approval process, not just the thumbs up in the agreement for cost and utilization, but also then the actual implementation. So I would say that some of people that have CAR T in their pipeline have tried to make some of these things happen concurrently. So while things are negotiating in the background, trying to obviously onboard the process of actually handling both an ordering as well as the administration on how to get it back and even provide the therapy. It does save a bit of time, and so that is helpful to try to catch some of these patients that have been kind of waiting for quite some time to have access to the therapy. Does it save a lot of time? No, unfortunately, to be quite honest, that this process is quite long and slow. So it does shave probably a couple months off the time overall, but not, substantial.
I don't know if anybody else wants to respond.
I'll just add a quick comment. I think in addition to all that, Canada is definitely a very advanced country when it comes to cell therapy compared to some other markets. And Canada has also been involved with many of those pivotal clinical trials, whether we are talking about academic CAR T, like the ones that Dr. Chu is working on, or other pharmaceutical company-sponsored clinical trials. So when it comes to access, I think, kudos to all the clinicians and investigators who are working hard, because definitely, yes, commercial product is a way of getting access to CAR T, but other potential would be the research pipeline that both academic and pharmaceutical companies are working on. And I know that many of my colleagues here and also many of the clinicians are actively fighting for Canadian patients to get access to clinical trials so that we can improve access here.
And I guess just, Jesse, did you want to add something?
No, not really. Maybe that referring to those points, access to clinical trials in general is not an easy task always, but having common process for different things might help. It's not necessarily because of industry or because of the clinicians. It's more the structure that we have that is like secure and have everything has its reason. But at the same time, in that setting, we are going back to being more flexible and adapt to make sure that everything is working well together.
Yeah. And I think just building off of that question, it's a little bit tangential, but with the increasing number of CAR Ts, does that help reduce the cost of the manufacturing?
If anything, actually, it might complicate life a little bit more, just because the manufacturing is relatively individualized. So I don't know if the cost per se is coming down. You do save a few things on terms of aggregating things, so quality assurance, quality control type measures. But the savings are not going to be that significant where you're not getting half, for example. But every little bit helps, in my opinion. But
Yeah. And we do have another question in the chat. With CCRM as a CDMO now in Ontario, will there be collaborations to manufacture homegrown CAR T? I also am aware that there is a facility out in Alberta, which this is where you're located, Dr. Chu. We have facilities spread across Canada. How can we make them better work for our homegrown products?
Gosh, that's a great question. I struggle with that question every day. Short answer to that is it is something that we would love to be able to coordinate better. No apologies necessary. The short version there is that I think it's going to require some national degree of coordination. I'm extremely intrigued by the CCRM. So for all the acronyms, the Canadian Centre for Regenerative Medicine and CDMO is a contract organization for manufacturing. So yes, I think the CCRM is a fantastic facility, the one that's being built at the moment. And when it becomes fully operational, I think we'll go a long way on satisfying what is currently indicated and required for helping patients that would qualify for cell therapy. As the indications spread out and then we start looking at solid organ tumors, things like breast cancer, lung cancer, glioblastomas, for example, I think that the likelihood of capacity is going to be an ongoing question. In Alberta, definitely, yes, we are expanding our lab footprint as well, trying to increase the number of clean room space that is GMP compliant for manufacturing. But if that coordination partially also depends on the regulatory space, I think because Health Canada has not been able to provide direction on how point of care manufacturing will be handled on an approval level, it's hard to coordinate because until we have some direction on that national level, we don't know how to coordinate. And then at that afterward, then we can say who will coordinate because it will be by committee. In theory, what I suspect will end up being the case is that Canada is a very large country, so shipping is always a concern as well. I think it will be separated along geographical lines where I suspect that CCRM will help Eastern Canada. And with our footprint in Western Canada, I think that we'll probably be able to help our Western Canadian colleagues. So hopefully that you're right, that we'll be able to coordinate and help our patients' needs.
All right, I'm just going to give each of you 30 seconds, your key takeaway, your key message to people listening. We'll start with you, Dr. Chu.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the key takeaway is that multiple myeloma is exciting with a lot of new immunotherapies, not just CAR T-cell bispecifics, but is a playground for how immunotherapy may be able to be applied across oncology and hematology. We're obviously excited, but as we talked about, limitations of capacity and the ability to treat patients are going to be things that we hopefully will answer in the years to come.
Jesse?
Yeah, capacity. So, for I guess what we can just keep in mind, all of us, while we're all working on our duties regarding that, is that for myeloma community members, this is important. This is future of treatment. There's hope for something that could look like a cure, or at least give them as long as possible without treatment. And this is the goal. This is why we're doing what we're doing. So whoever's listening, just keep that in mind.
And Henry?
So I'll say, first of all, hopefully art and craft is a good way of explaining CAR-T in the future. But joke aside, I think our company is very excited about cellular therapy and what it can do for our patients. We are working hard to try to bring it to Canada so that it can become available for our patients here.
I think that we're all going to be doing arts and craft to explain complex issues now. Thank you so much to the three panelists. I really appreciate the time that you gave today to be on the panel, to share your perspectives and your insights. And the webinar recording will be up on cancercolab.ca and our YouTube at Cancer Colab. Thank you very much, everybody.